Hi, everybody. I'm John Leslie, and I am the host of Talking About Radio. We've got something really technically very interesting to me today on this podcast, and that is that we're going to build a digital bridge from my studio in Winter Haven, Florida, to Phoenix, Arizona, to Burlington, Vermont, and back. And 20 years ago, we would never have been able to do this. And today it is so simple. And in doing so, I'm going to introduce our guest today, Chris LaBlanc, who is, you're physically in Phoenix, Arizona.
Yes, I am. Yes, sir.
All right. I'm sure I've confused the audience with that introduction there. Uh, your background in radio really didn't start early in. So many of our guests have said, I was a teenager and I'd go put my face against the window at the radio station and drool, and finally they would take pity on me and bring me in. That is not your story.
Not totally. To some extent, it is. I think some of my earliest recollections of radio was my dad took me to a radio station when I was probably about 8 or 10 years old. And to this day, I don't recall why we went. I think maybe one of my sisters had won something or something. It was a top 40 station in town, AM station, and my dad took me there, and I was hooked at that point. Um, Shortly afterwards, a studio came to be under the cellar stairs with my styrofoam cup microphone and talking into a vacuum cleaner hose. And hence a star was born. Now many years would go by. And I tried a couple of times, but no, I did not follow that traditional path like so many people you and I have worked with along the way. You come up through college radio and that sort of thing. I had a far different path. I tried a couple of times when I was a young man in my teens, and even as a young parent, some years later. I took a night course on broadcasting. I went and took my third class with broadcast endorsement,
Yeah.
which I missed by one, by the way. Dad drove me to Boston for nothing, basically. But
Now this is in Burlington, Vermont.
Yes, I grew up and lived in Burlington, Vermont, all of my life until just about 11 or 12 years ago. My wife and I decided to venture out a little bit, but so that's where I grew up, and I put those aspirations away. And years later, as a young parent, I was that Girl Scout dad. I was the Girl Scout dad who went on the field trip specifically because they were going to the local CHR station that evening. So, I was one of those guys. I tag along on my daughter's Girl Scout field trip, and pull the program director aside, and I got him aside for a minute or two and told him of my aspirations to be a radio star. And of course, he responds with the standard. He gives me his business card.
Yeah.
Which I should have seen as what it really was.
Thanks, but no thanks.
Thanks, but no thanks. And left. And a couple of days later, he said, give me a call sometime. Maybe we'll talk. Well, a couple of days later, I hadn't called him. I just put the card aside. I opened up the newspaper one morning to find that this guy had been fired as the program director of that particular station. So once again, my aspirations had to be put aside. Many years went by. I was lucky enough to have a full-time career. I worked for IBM for 34 years and got that job when I was 19 years old. So
wow.
One day I found myself in a hockey rink at 5 a.m. in the morning with my daughter, who had taken up women's ice hockey in Burlington, and took her to a practice one morning. And it was about 5 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, which is typical for hockey parents. And I went into the rink, and standing rinkside was another father from the team. And I knew him. So he was visiting with a guy that I recognized immediately as the program director of the local radio station, AM 620 WVMT. And his name was Mark Esberg.
That was the big station in Burlington.
Yes, it was. Yeah. It still is, by the way. It's talk station now. Directional, 5,000 watt station, directional. Big station, big signal. And I recognized him, what he did. I've seen him around town and stuff. So The other father, the three of us were standing there, and he went back into the cafeteria because the coffee was ready, and I found myself standing there with Mark, and I told myself, okay, you can do one of two things here, right? You can either turn around and walk away and probably forever regret it, or turn around and ask the guy, hey. So I did. I turned around and I said, hey, let me ask you something. We'd already been introduced, and I said, how does somebody like me get into radio? Now, as you said earlier, I didn't take the traditional path. I'm 36 years old now at this point in time. I'm a father. I've got a 16-year investment in my full-time career. And he looked at me, and my first thought was, oh my God, he's probably thinking, here we go, right? Another Howard Stern wannabe. And I said, well, before you answer, I said, let me explain. I already have a full-time career. And I work at IBM, and I told him my schedule and all. Mark has a very dry sense of humor. He's not in radio anymore, but he looked at me and he said, well, what are you doing Saturday night? And I thought he was kidding, and he wasn't. And on that coming Saturday night, I board opped my first Dick Bartley's Greatest Hits Saturday night. And there I was. So it started out right there, 36 years old, getting into the business, working nights, working weekends, doing all the crappy shifts.
We're talking with Chris LaBlanc. He's in Phoenix, Arizona, but his voice is well known up in Burlington, Vermont, way up on Lake Champlain, up in the northern part of Vermont. Now, was the program, was that on an ET, or was that on the network, or how did that come in? Bartley.
It was actually a seat. Bartley, the Saturday night show that he did at the time, that was satellite.
Oh, okay.
That was satellite delivered. And then I used to run Sunday mornings. He did a show called American Gold, and that was a CD delivered show. Did that one on CD. So, and one thing led to another. My dad was probably the smartest man I ever knew. Never made it any further than the 7th grade, by the way, but grew up in the Depression. And that greatest generation, right?
Yep.
And he told me when I was a kid, he said, whatever you do in your life, whatever you do, be the most versatile guy in the place. Because if you're the most versatile guy in the place, chances are you're going to be the last one to be let go.
Absolutely. What great advice.
And it was great advice. And I stuck to it. So along my 20 years plus in the business now, hey, you want to do donkey basketball? Sure, I'll do that. You want to, you want to do a Friday night all request show? Yeah, why not? Sure, I'll try that. And I didn't learn to say no. I couldn't say no. So just take advantage of the opportunities, I guess, is the message there.
Yeah. You talk about the donkey basketball. I've got a photograph. My best friend John Morgan, who has been in the radio business for 100 years, and I worked with him in Syracuse and Kansas City, and then I was in business with him. But when he was in Kansas City, he was at KCMO, and they talked him into doing a bull riding thing at a rodeo.
Oh man!
And a photograph was taken the instant that bull came out of the chute of Morgan's face, and it was the classic, how in the hell did I ever decide to do this?
Yeah, exactly. That's pretty impressive. I mean, riding a bull is far different than donkey. Donkey basketball was the most humiliating experience of my life because I got one of those donkeys that just refused to cooperate and just really wanted to go to the bathroom all over a very nice floor, by the way. It was humiliating as all get out. But this can be a humbling way to make a living. You and I both know that. And
yes.
The hard way, right? The hard way.
Yeah,
the first time I ever did an interview with a quote star was Peter Noon. And I had just gotten into VMT, just gotten into the business. Peter Noon was coming to town for a show. And somehow the station secured an interview with him. I did the interview with him, had the board in queue the whole time for the whole interview.
Oh, right. You didn't have the pod up.
It was up, but the board was in queue, I believe.
Oh.
And the feedback was horrendous. The feedback was just, I had no idea what I was doing. I was in a small production studio. Noon was a champion. He must have thought I was an idiot, but he handled the interview like a pro, gave me some liners, the whole bit. And then later I learned what I had done. And it's just one of many times, right, that we've all experienced something that can be rather humbling.
What do you recall the Dick Van Dyke Show?
Oh, of course.
And his boss was a bald-headed guy. The actor was Richard Deacon,
Hmm.
and it was I forget what his name was on the Dick Van Dyke Show. It was Dick Van Dyke's executive producer, but he
Mel
was
Cooley.
Mel Cooley. Okay, yeah. So Mel Cooley comes to town and into our station, and I was the news director, and I really wasn't interested all that much, other than it'd be kind of cool to meet him. But my boss, the program or the general manager, said, I want you to do a 1 hour interview with him. And so I put him in the studio with me and racked up the machine. And I did a 1 hour interview, which was pretty good. And he did it very well. He was in movies like The Birds and other things. And so I thanked him and off he went. And I went to listen to it back. And there was nothing there.
Oh my.
It was absolutely dead. It had not gone in. I had not put it into record mode, and I did
Hey,
the whole
we've all
interview.
done it.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
boss said, "Well, how'd the interview go?" I said, "Well, the interview was terrific."
Take my word for it. A couple of years later, I would interview Don McLean, and that went much better, by the way. By then, I learned exactly what I should be doing with the board. But oh yes, some of those early trips and falls, but that's how we learn.
Right.
That's how we learn.
So then, after how many years were you there at the VMT?
I was with VMT for 5 years,
Uh-huh.
and in 1998, I got a call to the office with the infamous "We're changing formats"
Uh-oh.
meeting. And yeah, they had this. We were still playing oldies. It was an AM station, still playing oldies. And of course, the handwriting was on the wall there, and so they were changing to a talk format. They wanted me to stay, but I got to thinking, what am I going to be doing, right? Board hopping, Rush Limbaugh. Um,
Yes, exactly.
so right. So I started looking around, and at this point, I had 5 years of experience under my belt, and I had actually done middays on BMT for a while. I moved to middays. I had an odd work schedule at IBM at the time, where I basically had one week I'd have 3 days off that week, and the next week I'd have four, and they were during the week. So I was able to do middays when I wasn't working at IBM. So me and another guy, Charlie Papillo, who's still around Vermont Radio, we shared middays. He did it on the days I was home sleeping because I was working third shift in those days, and then on my days off, I did middays on VMT. So gradually moved, into doing air work, but unfortunately, that came to an end in '98, and I started looking around, and I went to work for um, Hall Communications. It actually owns the stations that I currently voice track for and worked for. Well, I was with them almost 14 years before we left Vermont in 2011. Um, and that's where I really grew, if you will, as a announcer. Um, did did everything.
Well,
Worked the AM station.
Hall has a cluster of stations.
Hall has yes. Hall has a 5-station cluster now in Burlington, Vermont, and two of which I work on. And I think they have 17 or 18 stations on the East Coast.
Yeah.
In all, Providence, they're in Providence and Tampa,
Lake,
Lakeland, if you will.
Lakeland. There's stations in
Yep,
Lakeland.
right. And they have the 5-station cluster there in Burlington that I was lucky enough and to get into. And one thing kind of led to another, and before you knew it, I was over there. They had an AM station that they still have, little 1,000 watt AM station, and used to do the big band show on Saturday mornings. Not a clue what I was doing. All CD, all impromptu, no music sheets, no format logs, none of that. It was all from 7 to 10 a.m. Saturday mornings. It was nothing but Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey and all of them. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but somehow it worked out. It's a small audience with that particular station, but a very loyal audience, and it's old fashioned radio. That particular station is done like it used to be done. You know,
Well,
they still do the same morning show called The Breakfast Table. I think it's been called The Breakfast Table for 60 plus years. So it's amazing.
It doesn't make any difference the size of the audience. Our egos all, we wait for the book to come out, and we want to be number one or at least number two in our demographic or whatever. There's this ego thing about the size of the audience, but we fail to remember that the people, regardless of the size of the audience, whether it's 2 people or 20,000 people, we are providing them with entertainment. And there's nothing greater in life than to make somebody else happy. And if you're making 2 people happy or 20 people or 50 people, it's all the same thing. You are using your resources, your God-given ability to make other people smile and be happy and listen to the music and have a good time. And that's what's radio. That's what radio is supposed to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You hit the nail right on the head. Whether you're entertaining 2 or 200,000, it's still the same connection. And I know that sounds corny probably in today's world. And I know a lot of, the younger people today don't listen to radio the way we did. And they can't because the times are different, right?
Yes.
And radio's had to change. But there is still something about that connection that you have with your listener. I agree 100%. 100%.
Well, I want to rewind to 1967 or 1968, something around, I forget now, 67. I was working at WBVP in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, and it was owned by 3 guys out of the Pittsburgh market. We were right in the shadow of Pittsburgh, north of Pittsburgh. And the station had been put on the air in 1947 by 3 guys, Frank Smith, Tom Price, and Charlie Underko. And they had been in some radio and newspaper up in Pittsburgh, and they put the station on the air, WBVP. The station logo was "We Boost Valley Progress." Kind of hokey, but it was a very powerful station in Beaver County and some of the surrounding counties north of Pittsburgh. Well, they didn't know it, but they didn't want any of the staff to know that the station was for sale. But we all knew it because they would have these meetings in the studios and our engineers would plug the mics on. And we could, they would pipe it out through all the speakers in the rest of the station, and we could hear these meetings and these phone conversations going on. And so people would come and look at the station and leave and then come back. Well, finally it was sold to Hall Communications.
No kidding.
And the guy at that time, after they bought it, he came around and was like the interim general manager for a while. His name was Don Lawfer. I don't know whether Don Lawfer means anything to you or not, but he was the corporate general manager of Hall Communications.
Wow. No, it doesn't, unfortunately, but I'm going to ask, believe me.
Yeah, Don Lawfer. And he was a good and bad guy. He, on one hand, he would be in there and he'd be backslapping. And then if you made the mistake of asking the wrong question, he wasn't backslapping anymore. He was
right.
And they weren't a bad company. I mean, they were pretty good people. And I worked for them probably for another 6 or 8 months or something like that. And then I went on to Youngstown, Ohio, and TV news and radio there. But I always had fond memories of Hall Communications. And if I remember correctly, Hall was actually in the cartoon syndication business.
Yes. Dennis the Menace.
Yes.
Hall syndicated. Yes. Dennis the Menace.
And then, and I don't want to take up your time. This is your time, but I can't help we can't help ourselves when we start talking about radio. John Morgan, who I had mentioned, and I had started a business where we were working with radio and TV stations across the country, doing seminars for them, and became a very successful business for 18 years. And so I visited the Hall Group in Lakeland. I made a personal visit there. And the general manager of those stations wasn't as interested in our program as I had hoped. I had hoped to get a commitment for all of the Hall stations. And the program director of one of the stations was there in the meeting. And before we left, he offered me a job doing the morning show. Uh, and at that time, that was the last thing I needed. It was
Right.
it was a great honor to have been asked, but we were running this company, and I just couldn't see myself dragging my ass out of bed at 4:30 in the morning and driving to Lakeland and doing another morning show after 50 years or whatever it is.
This
But
blows my mind, John. This blows my mind. What a small world.
yeah, isn't it though?
What are the odds? What are
Yeah.
the odds that you would have worked for the company that I currently work for? Holy cow! What a small world.
But yeah, it would have been different if we were talking about iHeart. Everybody worked for iHeart, and everybody got fired at iHeart.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I know. It's just that by broadcasting standards, right? Hall is a small company by broadcasting standards. When you compare them to some of the conglomerates, yeah, for
yeah.
sure. Yeah,
Well,
but still, it just blows my mind here. I'm taken back by this.
well, we're talking with Chris LaBlanc. He's physically located in Phoenix, Arizona, and I want to, in a little bit, I want to find out about how he got to Phoenix, and it's probably the same way that my wife and I got to Florida. We decided to do it. It was too cold up in New York. I'd had it with that, but what I want to know is what you are doing, how you are physically involved in getting yourself on the air in Burlington, Vermont, from Phoenix, Arizona.
You mean how is it
Yeah,
done,
what
or
are
how
you
did I
doing?
get?
What is your deal? What is your setup?
Well, it's all software driven, right? I mean, when you add a voice processing unit to a good quality studio microphone and with some fancy software, um, it can be done. It like you said earlier, 20 years ago, even 11 years ago, the technology was there, but you had to do it in house.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't exist remotely. I couldn't have ever thought that. When I left the business in 2011 and moved to Virginia, I never thought I was going to be in radio again. I thought I was done. I thought that's it. I've had my 15 minutes, so to speak. And
Yeah.
I moved to Roanoke, Virginia for 7 years. And I actually did an audition shift there one Saturday afternoon on the country station, Star Country, WSLC in Roanoke. And I got a Saturday afternoon audition shift on a board that I hadn't seen in years. In fact, I'd never seen this particular board. Vox Pro, I hadn't seen a Vox Pro in 10 years, right? So whatever it was. And it didn't work out because they wanted somebody live, and I thought that they were hiring a recorded situation. So I had moved to Roanoke, left Vermont in 2011, just kind of tired of winters, as you said, the bitter cold and winters. I have two daughters, one of which at the time lived in Roanoke, and one of which lived in Chicago at the time. I had no intention of going to Chicago, so my daughter had moved to Roanoke, had our first grandchild, and I'll tell you the pull, the power of a grandchild is an immense force.
Yes, it is.
And that's how we ended up in Virginia. So after all my life in Vermont, my wife and I as well, my life grew up in Vermont, right there in Burlington.
Interesting. I'm sorry. I'm embarrassed that I'm not going to be able to remember this gentleman's name. I just did a program about 2 weeks ago with a gentleman who spent most of his career in Pennsylvania, in the cities in Pennsylvania, and he moved to Roanoke. And it was, and maybe if I remember correctly, still is on the air in Roanoke. I remember what he talked about. The station was in a hotel, and the studios were like on the first floor of this hotel. It was the premier station, I guess, in town. And I don't know why I'm even going down this path, because I can't remember the guy's name. I want to say Jeff Hunt, but I don't think that's correct. Maybe it is. But it was a great interview, and the guy was really terrific. And he's in Roanoke. End of my story. It was there's no climax to it.
There's another irony right there. What are the odds, right?
Yeah.
I go to Roanoke. You know somebody in Roanoke.
I thought you were going to say, "Oh, I know that guy."
But it was a hard thing to do, because in 2011, my wife and I decided that, hey, we're going to just try something different. I was able to retire from IBM at that point in time, and I hated to give up radio. But to be honest with you, I had actually gotten quite burned out.
Yeah, it's
In
easy.
2003, now you're a newsman, you're an old newsman, so you can appreciate this. In 2003, they came to me and said, "Hey, how would you like to try morning drive news?" And of course, with my inability to say no, I did morning drive news for the last 8 years that I was there, which was from '03 to 2011. I did morning drive news on all five of the stations in Burlington. So you know how that goes, right? Up at
Yes.
3,
Yeah.
in at 4. First newscast was at 5. I did my news live on 3 of the stations because they were in the same building. The other 2 stations were on the other side of town. I would email them over my newscast, refresh them every hour, and I stayed in the studios until 7:30. And then at 7:30 a.m., I'd hop in the car, drive to my real job, and work the day at IBM. So it tended to be long days, and over that 8 years or so, started to get burned out on things, and wanted a change of scenery, wanted a change of weather. Had a daughter in Roanoke. The weather was a lot more temperate,
Yeah.
and we ended up there. We ended up there. So I
You had
finished my career. Go ahead.
you retired from IBM at that point.
I was able to retire from IBM, but I was still too young to actually retire. I was only 54
Oh,
at the time. So I had to find a job, right? So I was lucky enough. I left IBM after 34 years, moved to Roanoke, Virginia, went to work for GE, of all things. So I went from one big company to another, but I was lucky enough to have found something, and I worked for GE, and finally um, moved out here to Phoenix in 2018. That's where the other daughter comes in, by the way. My daughter had left Chicago and ended up here. So my wife and I were looking for something different. This was certainly different for us. So we moved out here in 2018.
I also worked for General Electric. Um, I did the
John,
more.
this is crazy. You must
I
have worked on one of their
I
stations.
did. I did the morning show on WGY in Albany. Did very well. And it was a great company, a great station to work for. Uh, I'm sorry, General Electric was a little difficult to work for. I had never worked for a company quite that large, and so things were different. They would come to me a year later and say, "You remember back when we moved you from Kansas City to Albany? Yeah. What did your wife and daughter have for lunch on the way?" I said, "How do I remember?" And they said, "Well, we're doing an audit, and we need to know whether we overpaid you for the expenses." And it was just a totally different thing. It was radio, but it was huge corporation radio.
It's a culture change for sure.
Yes.
Oh
And
yeah.
I'm sure the same thing was with Westinghouse at KDKA and WBZ. They probably had that same kind of culture. You may be a radio star, but you're no different than the guy who puts the filaments in the light bulbs down at the light bulb factory. You're just you're just a number.
It is
You
a
know what?
unique culture for
Yeah.
sure.
And
Yeah.
I worked for a number of years, Chris. Chris LeBlanc is our guest today on Talking About Radio, and he's in Phoenix, Arizona. And through various quirks of fate, I worked for Stoner Broadcasting System, and Stoner had a very successful group in Binghamton, New York, which was in the triple cities of Binghamton, Johnson City, and Endicott, the original home of IBM.
Right.
And at the time that I first started at WNBF, there were 30 or 40,000 IBMers at the where was it Tom Watson or what's it Watson was his name, the guy that
Right.
founded
Yep.
IBM?
Yes,
Is the
Tom Watson.
Endicott Clock Company, I think it was, the time clock company.
Right.
And
Started off as a tabulating company. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
and
Yep.
the majority of my audience, and we were very successful there doing a morning show. The majority of my audience were IBMers, and the joke always was at 7:30 every morning, 20,000 garage doors would open, and 20,000 cars would back out.
You know,
Oh.
I was I was very lucky. When I think about IBM, here I had this job that provided a good salary, a good income, stability for my families, provided some opportunities, and yet I was able to play on the radio for fun. Because I didn't do it for the money. I did it because I wanted to do it, and it's something. It was a challenge to me to try it, because I am a very introverted person. And I think you would agree with me when I say that a lot of people in radio are rather quiet. I don't exactly light up a room when I come into it. You
Hmm.
know, now you and I, having said that, you and I both work with people who do light up a room or think they do when they come into it, right? Hey,
Yeah.
everybody, I'm here. You know, I'm not that type of personality. I'm just not that type of personality. But somehow, when I'm in a studio and I'm in front of a microphone and I envision what is my listener doing today, what is my listener doing this afternoon, I try to relate to that, and somehow it works. Somehow I got it to work along the way. A lot of practice.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of an in between there guy. I don't walk into the room and say, "Hey, folks, dig me. I'm here." Uh, I'm just me until somebody gives me the green light. If they say, John, tell us about this thing that you did, and I did a lot of things over the years. I traveled all over the world, broadcasted from Kathmandu, Nepal, and up on Mount Everest, and Moscow and Siberia, and it was just a great run. And if somebody says, "Didn't you broadcast from Yerevan, Armenia?" Yeah, well, tell us about that. Well, then the green light's on, right?
Right,
And
right.
so then I can do that, and I can derive a certain amount of pleasure from doing that, and I have to know when to stop because I look at the people's eyes in the room, and if I see them darting away, I know it's time to get to the end of the
Wrap it up, huh?
story. Yeah, right.
Well, I've been lucky. I've been lucky, and some of it was luck, some of it was fate, some of it was hard work.
Well,
And
talent too. I mean, you can't.
well,
But one of the things, Chris LeBlanc, one of the things that it was fortunate for you, and not so much for the majority of people in the broadcasting business, is that you had something to fall back on. They couldn't threaten you with loss of
right,
job. So
right,
many other people, that's the only job they had, and if they screwed up and got a reprimand of any kind, then there was nothing else to do. And I often thought about the fact that even though my career was very successful, what would I do if it ended?
mhm,
I think would I go to work in a picture framing shop or, I don't know what I would have done. But
right.
fortunately, that didn't have to happen.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's why I say, my road was a little unconventional, but
Oh,
somehow it worked. And you're right. I had that luxury of an income that I knew was, safe, and I had a hobby that I got paid for. I had this wonderful hobby that I got paid for. That's
oh,
how I looked
how
at it.
long are you going to do this?
As long as I can,
Yeah.
as long as I can. This voice tracking world is certainly different. I've been doing it now almost a year, and that's a whole different end of the business. I had never voice tracked to this level. I had done some voice tracking prior to retiring in 2011, but as I said earlier, that was all in house. You recorded it in house, and to be able to do it from 2,700 miles away
Yeah.
it still blows my mind. It still blows my mind.
Well, as we reach the end of our time here, Chris, tell me about where I when we moved to Florida, my wife Amity and I moved to Florida. We looked around. We looked in the Carolinas. We thought maybe Charleston was going to be our landing spot, and we had the very good fortune of having some free years that we traveled the country on a motorcycle. And some of our greatest experiences were through Arizona, down through Phoenix and Tucson, and down to Bisbee and um, Tombstone, and up to Mount Lemmon out of Tucson. I mean, some just great motorcycle riding. And my wife rode with me, and there's nothing like that to have. We were at Yellowstone. We went to Death Valley. We did all of these in the high plains of New Mexico, and on the bike. And your hearts beat as one when you're on a motorcycle. And
Hmm.
we had the best conversations along the way, and we talked about Arizona, and we looked at all of the landscape out there, and we thought, well, gee, maybe Arizona would be the place that we ought to uh, investigate or ultimately end or land. But no, we chose Florida. Are you in like a community, a metropolitan area? Or you live out in the desert with the Gila monsters and the where?
Both.
Oh, really?
Yes, yes, and yes. I am in Phoenix. I reside in the city of Phoenix. I pay my taxes to the city of Phoenix, but I'm actually in what's known as North Phoenix. I'm probably uh, 20 minutes from downtown Phoenix, 25 minutes from downtown Phoenix. But I'm in North Phoenix, which is more, a lot of subdivisions. I live in a retirement community here, and my wife and I love it here. But my older daughter, the one that used to live in Chicago, had since moved here, and that's how we ended up coming here, as I said.
Yeah.
And everybody, I can remember when I told people we're moving to Arizona. Oh my God, it's so hot! It's blasted hot, and it is. But you know what? That's for about 3, maybe almost 4 months. The other 8 months of the year, the other 9 months of the year, consistently, beautiful.
Yeah.
You can't. The one thing, obviously, my family's on the East Coast. I've got a daughter now in Washington. My daughter that used to live here, she's really gotten around, but it's because of her husband's career. He's a surgeon, and they're up in Washington now, Washington State. So they've left here. But my wife loves it here. We love the weather. It's pretty consistent. Yes, it is hot in the summertime, and that's when we typically get out of Dodge. Like
Yeah.
like where I grew up, you got out of Dodge in February. Everybody went to Florida, right? Here, you get out of Dodge in the summertime because it is rather hot. Yes,
Yeah, it can
yes,
be. Now,
yes.
my daughter lives still in upstate New York. She's up in Queensbury, and
Oh, yes.
her in-laws, her husband's parents, he was a retired physician from Long Island, and they bought a house on Lake Champlain at Orwell, Vermont.
Oh,
And
yes.
so for quite a number of years, we would be a Thanksgiving dinner there at their house on the shores of Lake Champlain, and then we'd find our way up to Burlington every once in a while. And my daughter's sister-in-law was married at a yacht club up in Burlington, maybe 6 years ago or seven, and we went to the wedding, and it occurred out on a veranda at this yacht club. And so the wedding occurred, in the typical bride and groom and all of the party and all of that, and all of the boats down in the yacht basin. When they got to the point where they said "I do" and they kissed each other, all of the boats down in the yacht basin sounded their horns.
Yeah, I miss Vermont. I do. Don't get me wrong. I miss Vermont. I miss Lake Champlain. I miss
Yeah,
water.
yeah,
We have lakes out here, but when you grew up on the sixth largest lake in the U.S., to see a lake in Arizona, it just doesn't do much for you.
yeah. What was it?
they're
Well,
not they're landlocked, they're landlocked lakes, and they're much smaller than Lake Champlain. But I do miss the lake. I miss the water. Um, and obviously, my family's there, and it's
sure.
still home. It'll always be home.
Well, Chris, when you were in Burlington, did you go down every day and buy a pint of Ben and Jerry's ice cream?
Let me tell you just briefly. I'll keep this brief. I was buying Ben and Jerry's ice cream when they were in their famous gas station location. Whether you know it or not, Ben and Jerry started in an old abandoned gas station. The two guys bought a couple of pieces of equipment, both a couple of hippies. They needed a job,
Yeah,
and they bought this equipment. And I was working at the time for the Burlington Free Press. I had just gotten out of high school, and we used to go to City Hall Park right there in downtown Burlington to have our lunch, and then we'd walk across the park to Ben and Jerry. So I've been buying Ben and Jerry since it was coming out of a gas station.
right. Well, I was not aware. I've got a very dear friend who lives in State College, Pennsylvania. He works for AccuWeather. His name is Joe Sobel. Dr. Joe was on, probably, I don't know, 75 radio stations from the east to the west coast every morning doing AccuWeather forecasting. And they live in State College, Pennsylvania, the home of Penn State. And so whenever we would visit Joe and Jackie down in Penn State, we'd occasionally tour the campus, and they have an ice cream making curriculum there. And
Really?
yeah, you go get this really rich ice cream there, and you get samples of it. And their big thing is, hey, did you know that Ben and Jerry learned how to make ice cream here?
Oh my! Oh
Yeah,
my!
they
Yeah,
went.
they did. Go ahead.
No, that's it.
I was going to say they did rather well for themselves, the two.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
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 Cherry
they did. But
Garcia is one
interesting.
of the guys.
Yeah, Cherry Garcia. Interesting,
All right.
interesting story there from my past. Yeah.
Well, Chris, we are at the end of our time, and as always, these things get to be really great fun. And when they're downloaded, it's astounding, Chris. They're downloaded all over the world, from Namibia to we had 2 downloads yesterday from Australia, and a lot of them are heard in Germany and places that I've never even heard of.
Wow.
Download these
Finally, I
things.
have a worldwide audience.
You do.
Finally.
Yes. I hope
Thank
you're
you,
not
John.
wanted for something in Namibia.
I'll find out.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, and in any case, these things turn into just such great fun for me. And I think to myself, we're going to probably go a half hour, and they always end up going a lot longer than that. And then I get emails from people, and they say, that was so interesting, and you made me laugh. And I heard this, and I laughed out loud, and it's just so great. And I'm so pleased, Chris, that you were able to participate in this, because you've got a great story, and all of the radio stories that we have on talking about radio are um, interesting to me, and we hope they're interesting to non-radio people as well. But in any case, thank you so much for taking time on your Thursday morning to get up early and well, you had to be up early anyhow, right, to do your voice.
I'm an early bird.
Okay.
I'm an early bird. Still got that news schedule in me, I guess.
I guess so. Chris LaBlanc.
John, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.